I've worked many odd jobs throughout my life. One of them was at a used video media store. They had movies and TV shows, as well as video games and consoles. People could come into the store as well and pawn their items. Part of my job was to make offers on the things customers would bring in. And that's how I came across this item. This memory card acts like a jailbreak device for the PS2. It lets you run software off a hard drive, a USB, or even the memory card itself. We couldn't take it in at the store, so I gave the guy a few bucks and bought it for myself. This opened up a whole new world of usability for the PS2. The biggest draw for most would probably be that you can run games off an external hard drive. But one of the first things that caught my eye was that there were emulators built into it. If you don't know, an emulator is a program that allows one piece of hardware to read programs that were designed for something else. Most commonly, they are used to play console games on PCs. So I was intrigued by the concept of emulators that can run on the PS2. And there are a ton. My idea was to start by testing every Nintendo console and see how they run and whether any of them are actually viable ways to play these games. As I go through each one, I'll break down how it performs and give it a letter grade at the end. I wasn't expecting many of these to be good, and in some cases I was right, but in others I was pretty blown away by my findings. The NES emulator I'm using is called PS2 FCE Ultra. There are a few other ones I found online, but this one was working the best for me. Setup was very simple and everything worked right away. The interface is pretty straightforward and basic, but functional. Every game I tested loaded quickly and ran well. Performance is consistently strong with good FPS and only occasional dips. There are some minor audio glitches, but nothing that really gets in the way. This made the experience of playing the NES games really smooth and seamless. Customization options are pretty limited. You can remap buttons and use turbo for rapid fire. However, I found it frustrating that you need to map all available buttons. A DualShock 2 only has so many buttons, and some of these I would like to leave unmapped. There's also a config file you can edit on your PC for some additional tweaks. Aside from that, you can select NTSC or PAL for region-free use, but that's really it for display settings. For some reason, there's a low-pass filter option in the game, which I found kind of amusing. Save states are here too, but I couldn't get them working. The NES doesn't require much hardware power to run, and because of that, the experience is essentially uncompromised. This feels almost perfect compared to just playing the original system, especially when hooked up to an old CRT. NES gets an S. There are two SNES emulators on PS2 that I could find, but I went with SNES Station since again, it gave me the best results. The emulator has a very bootleg aesthetic, with custom background music and a Mario-themed background. Out of everything I looked at, this was the only emulator that went so above and beyond with the presentation. As far as the actual performance, every game I tested was able to load, but depending on which game you play, you're going to have a range of experiences. Visuals can suffer from slowdown, and the audio can get very grating, stuttery, and glitchy. With sound turned off, the performance improves quite a bit, but that's a pretty major compromise. I never really felt like I was getting an authentic experience like what I was able to get on the NES, even though at times things were working generally well. Options are available for mono sound, which can lower sound fidelity, and it can improve performance slightly without completely muting everything. Save states did work at one point, although I couldn't capture it on video, and in-game saving works as expected. There's a built-in save manager for your games and a toggle for FPS display, but that's where the features end. I couldn't find any speed-up options or anything else of note. Even though everything technically works, the experience is compromised. You have to mute the game just to get decent performance, and it's hard to call that a good solution. I was expecting the SNES to perform a lot better in-game, and despite the high compatibility with most games, SNES gets a C. I was able to get the N64 games running using Dataless Emulator. This software was originally made for the PSP and ported over. Getting it set up took a long time, especially getting it to recognize my games. Once everything is working, it actually looks really promising. There are tons of customization options, and the emulator even loads box art automatically for each game. With some tweaking, you can get certain games running at a decent frame rate. You can tell this is not normal for a PS2 since it has to run all this arbitrary code just to get the games to load up. However, once you actually get into a game is when it gets real. Performance drops significantly with sound enabled, but the biggest issue is how the emulator renders graphics. Visuals are heavily glitched, making it difficult to actually play. Granted, this can result in some very funny and unexpected moments, but it's not like playing a real N64 game. As the software was fully built out for the PSP, it is featured with lots of different display options for different resolutions, and external displays. There are also in-depth customization options you can set for each game, along with some built-in fixes for specific titles. I mean, look at this, you can program the dead zone of the stick, all kinds of alternate control schemes. I'd love to see this PS2 port fixed up, as there's some serious potential here. But as it stands, it's more of a novelty than a real way to experience any N64 games. It's fun to test and see what happens, but it's not something you'd realistically use. I was pleasantly surprised by a lot of things here, but there were more unpleasant surprises. N64 gets a D. Next, let's look at the handhelds. The Game Boy and Game Boy Color emulator for PS2 is called PS2 Info GB. I needed another emulator to run Game Boy Color games from Game Boy Advance games, so I'm going to grade them separately. Original Game Boy ROMs work on this as well, so I'll grade those together. Getting everything set up was pretty easy. The games require pretty much no hardware power, so everything runs smoothly right away. Game Boy runs perfectly, and Game Boy Color dips only slightly. Unfortunately, some games just don't load at all, and there are occasional crashes. Otherwise, there's authentic visuals and audio. Being able to play these games blown up on a big screen with a controller is a fantastic experience. The analog sticks of the DualShock feel really good here when mapped to the D-pad. There's good screen stretch options and controller customization available. Save states exist, but I couldn't get them working here either. There is an option to show FPS and for custom button configuration, but there's no speed up option again, which I was really hoping for. Playing Game Boy is incredibly consistent and smooth, making it a great experience overall. Game Boy Color is still very good, but the inconsistency and lack of quality of life features holds the whole package back. I'll give it a B, because I was expecting everything to run pretty much flawlessly, and I was hoping for some kind of speed up options. But it's right on the verge of an A. For the GBA, again, there was a few options, but I went with Temp GBA, since everything was very easy to set up, and I was immediately impressed with how well it worked. Performance is generally excellent, and the audio quality is also very strong, which is something that can't be said for some of the other emulators. This thing has all the customization options you could want, including a speed-up feature. This is by far the most feature-rich emulator I tested. Tons of display and input settings, hotkeys, a whole save manager, as well as performance and debugging panel. This is basically on par with something you might find on an old-school PC emulator. One thing I noticed pretty quickly, however, was that the games take a really long time to load up, which can cause the overall experience to drag a little bit. Since the GBA is also home to a lot of Super Nintendo ports, it makes it a surprisingly good way to run some of these games that don't run well on the SNES emulator. In my mind, I was thinking that Super Nintendo was going to blow away the GBA, and actually it was the opposite. For some more action-packed games or when there's lots of sprites on the screen, there can be some significant lag. However, for most games, it's pretty much locked in at 60 all the time. I was pretty close to giving this one an S, but because of the significant lag in some games, I would have to give GBA an A. While I was scouring the internet for this video, I found a program called Melon DS. This emulator is a self-described proof of concept. According to the website, it was put together by just a few people across 2 days of work, and it shows. There's quite a bit of setup involved just to get the program to launch and read games. The emulator can only load ROMs under 8 megabytes and is extremely limited. There's no touch support, and every game pretty much just loads to a white screen. I was just trying to get footage to show that the emulator, in fact, did not work, when Elf Bowling for some reason did load, and runs about 2 frames per second. That being said, I did manage to actually get a strike somehow. This is not really a usable emulator. At best, it's a technical experiment. There's no meaningful options here. You can decide between horizontal and vertical display modes, and that's it. I was very surprised that I even got the one game to load, and it would be interesting to test some more out, but DS does get an F. After testing everything, I think the biggest takeaway is that the PS2 can do a lot more when it comes to emulation than most people might expect. However, that still doesn't make it good. The NES and Game Boys were the standouts when it came to genuine use cases, and the SNES can work well if you're willing to make some sacrifices. N64 and DS were both totally broken, but still kind of fun to test and play around with. And overall, that's all this was meant to be, a fun experiment to test and play around with. Thanks for watching.